What a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really very meaningful for me to be here in this celebration of 20 years of Partners Slovakia and to engage in this discussion. Moving from Slovakia to Europe, now I'm going to try and talk about my perspective of working on some of these issues at a global level. And there's so much to say to build on what was already said. So I'll try really hard. I'm going to just give some brief examples so that we can engage in the conversation together this afternoon. But as Dusan said, I'm here in representation of a global network of organizations, Partners for Democratic Change International. You see on the map this high concentration in Europe. And in the European neighborhood countries because of our organization got its start here 25 years ago. And so a lot of the expertise and learning and innovation of working on these issues comes from this region that we're now really bringing all over the world and adapting in Latin America and Africa and the Middle East. So it's a real pleasure to be able to describe to you what some of our colleagues in those countries are doing. It's a network of organizations similar to PDCS, local organizations from local leaders, as Kinga said, how important that leadership component is. And we, from a network perspective, are trying to support their own efforts. So I'm going to describe to you a little bit about the strategies about what some of those colleagues are working on. So when I was asked to talk about social conflicts, I actually was thinking about the changing nature of how we might think of social conflicts. Because the ambassador mentioned that we have a sensation that the world is more violent now, actually. And it's interesting, you know, there's some statistics that are captured. There's an organization in Australia, the Institute for Economics and Peace, that have been trying to do studies on actually the world is not more violent right now with regards to people being killed through violent action. We have been progressively getting less and less violent, if that's how you would determine social conflict. But the fact of the matter is our world is changing. So the nature of social conflicts, if we really thought of our work as wanting to mitigate conflict between countries, to ensure that people, you know, were living in a peaceful society free from harm in their person, really, we face different challenges today. And I think that, at least in our work from an international perspective, we realize that the rate of change is causing so many of the different social conflicts. And that what that means is the complexity of what we have to deal with. So the fact that Dusan says, I don't really know what's going on in Hungary, that's actually the question to continue to remind ourselves, what is happening? How can we look at these social conflicts in a systemic way? And how can we recognize that we actually need to think beyond our own piece of the puzzle to be able to incorporate additional considerations in dealing with social conflicts? So the themes that I'm going to want to talk about then is with regards to what is civil society's response to these changing types of conflicts, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them, is that we really have to force ourselves to think about how we collaborate across sectors. And that is a change in the way that we work and how we think about civil society. And so if we're breaking down mistrust, if we feel that there's weak civil society sector, how are we strengthening ourselves? But how are we strengthening ourselves through collaboration with other sectors? And that includes businesses, and that includes government institutions, and that includes people that we're not used to working with. So those are the themes that I'm going to want to talk about, because, again, if the pace of change is what's driving these changes, for example, in the Arab Spring countries, I feel like we were caught off guard a little bit. With all of a sudden something happened that we weren't really prepared for as a sector. So I'm going to frame this discussion in 4 different trends that I see globally and that we've been discussing a lot as a network. So this first trend And it's been mentioned here with regards to what we're calling closing political spaces. And I have particular leaders up here, but really, it is about charismatic leaders, and it is about people perhaps who were democratically elected. So if we define democracy in that way, they're democratically elected, and then there is a movement to close the political space, to consolidate power, and quite honestly, a rejection of democratic values openly. And that's a new trend. I think in the 90s, we felt that democracy won, that this was what our new governmental systems were going to be based upon. This is not taken for granted anymore. I think the Chinese model has a lot to do with that. But I also think that there's a roadmap, whether it's Egypt, Venezuela, Russia, maybe Iran. There's a roadmap that leaders are taking with regards to their own election, and then consolidation of institutions, parliament, judiciary, any kind of independence with their people. There's kicking out of international donors. We don't need your support anymore, thank you very much. And what does that mean is that civil society organizations who take international money are seen as foreign agents in these countries, and they're demonized. And as Kinga mentioned, you find a common enemy, and you demonize the other. Maybe inside is the other, or outside is the other. In some cases, it's the West, or it's the United States. So there's a geopolitics that makes it easy to demonize. You control the media. This is happening in every single one of these countries. And when Kinga said, "Where's the resistance?" I actually thought to myself, it reminds, I don't know if you have this saying in this part of the world, but the frog who is in the boiling water, and it just gets hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. The frog never jumps out, and eventually is boiling and dies. This is what's happening in the closing political spaces. And so what I want to say is, well, what do we do as an international community of people who do value democratic values? And we want to support our colleagues in these countries, but it's actually even dangerous at this point to be supporting them. They are putting themselves at danger. So I'd like to say a couple of things of what we're doing globally. One is we've determined a strategy of going very local. We are not working, especially you see what happened in Egypt, the Freedom House, the democracy organizations, they're being put in jail, they're on trial. So we are not pushing a national agenda in Russia and Venezuela and Egypt and these countries. We are going very local with grassroots organizations who really can hopefully continue to affect what happens in their lives through local decision making, because we do find that in these systems, the local decision makers continue to be open to citizens' voices, because trash collection actually it happens better if we have people to participate, because you want the citizens in these countries to continue to exercise this muscle of having a voice. So we've been going very local. There are councils in Venezuela that are set up. In Iran, when we say going very local, dealing with conflict resolution in Iran, there are huge apartment buildings in Tehran where thousands of people live together. There's a ton of social conflict in these apartment buildings. So we're working with a local partner just to help mediate those discussions. We care about democracy. We care about social change. But the way that we're continuing to be involved in that situation is through a very local level. The other strategy is to continue to support collective action. Again, it doesn't have to be collective action for freedom of the press or separation of powers. It can be collective action on animal rights. And we've been working with colleagues in Kuwait, groups of people. There is very little civic space in Kuwait. And so if you're trying to, again, build kind of these muscles of continuing to be active, find the issues that people care about, and then help them find networks of people who also care about that issue to just support that collective action. These are very concrete, hopefully building blocks in the long term. And then finally, I wanted to say, with regards to kind of this spark of the youth movement in Hungary, the one thing, at least in our community, in the donor community, there's a lot of romanticism about youth movements. and how the young people are going to make the change. And maybe starting to say, you know, those democracy organizations that have been working for 20, 25 years, it's the same old, same old. You know, they have a nice office now in the capital city, and they don't have a constituency. So let's stop funding them. Let's go find the sexy new youth movement organization. Maybe they're not even registered, and that's who we should be funding. And we actually disagree with this. We agree with the idea, but what we need to be doing is making the links between those youth activists to have an ongoing channel for their motivation through connections with those NGOs. Because sometimes I think having the constituency to continue the action is what's the challenge, but those NGOs do have those skills, so we're looking to build the links. And then finally, what I want to say is we can't step away from a country like Russia because it's too hard right now. We have to maintain as an international community those links. We have to accompany them. We have to be in conversation. We have to invite them to our conferences. And so as a network, we've been trying to do this. I'm just touching on these. I feel dissatisfied with the level, but I just wanted to give you a taste of kind of some strategies. We mentioned this idea of the rise of extremism. And this is happening again all over the world. It's happening in my country. We have growing intolerance. And so with regards to thinking about this as a very complex issue, the international rhetoric around combating extremism, at least at a global level, is a security issue. We're worried about terrorism. And we're trying to deal with this issue in a different way by not seeing it as a security issue. We're really seeing it as a development issue. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if you're thinking about the complexity, and if you're thinking about what has led these underlying causes to why there's the rise in extremism, you have to try and put yourself in the position of the extremists. And that's a theme that I have with regards to how we change how we think of our work with regards to empathetic leadership. And so I liked the example of the German project. Another example I find very interesting is an organization in the UK called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Some of you might know of them. And they have this great project called the FREE initiative. I can't remember what FREE stands for, but extremism is in there somewhere and combating it. And they have these nice videos where they tell the story, like actual stories of human beings who were a part of extremist movements, who then got out and are talking about why they felt the way that they did. And then they dialogue. So very interesting way of thinking about it. But what I want to say is, you know, young men, and not just men throughout the world, who are feeling disempowered, they're feeling hopeless. Maybe they're in a system like Tunisia, where their religious beliefs were repressed for a long time, and now all of a sudden you're in a free society where actually you can express your religious beliefs. The #1 recruitment center in Syria right now for those fighters is Tunisia. It's an open democracy, and young men are flooding by the thousands to fight for the cause of the extremists. So we've got to deal with the economic reality of these young men. And in Iraq, for example, we have a program where we are working with young people through the arts, through a lot of different things to just help them through very small little community projects so that they feel like they're a part of something else in their community. These are tiny little small examples. But again, I don't think we can think only of extremism through this lens of just intolerance, because it has to be coming from the perspective of what are the root causes. The third trend that we're particularly, we're all concerned about all of these, is the rise of these illicit criminal networks throughout the world. And In Central America, we are feeling the rising in Mexico, the gang threats in those countries, that really the problem is not political violence. The problem is organized crime and drug trafficking and the total state capture of those networks. And then we are facing a crisis of migration because young people are flooding out of those situations. But I put the corruption issue here as well because obviously we think about corruption, I think, from a systemic perspective and political leaders, but really, I think the money involved in organized crime is contributing to overall kleptocracies, whether it's Nigeria, other countries, who really are facing serious problems with regards to the government's ability to function. And so I think that our anti-corruption initiatives have to be also changing to adapt. So what I wanted to say with regards to some of our strategies as a network is actually to head on start work more with the security sector and the police and the military. This feels very uncomfortable to NGOs, doesn't it? We're used to being a watchdog organization. So in Mexico, for example, there are human rights organizations that are very worried about the human rights abuses as the state and the society gets more and more nervous about organized crime. If you have a tattoo and are walking down the street, the police might pick you up because you're probably a risk. This probably shouldn't happen. You're jailed without, for a long time without any kind of allegation because you look perhaps like you could be affiliated with a crime network. There are people in the human rights field, and then the hard security, they say in Spanish, mano dura, the hard fist, that have to get together at both a local level and a national level to say, what are the indicators that we're all going to work on to address this security concern, to protect human rights, and to bring security? And we're trying to facilitate these dialogues at both the national level, but also throughout Central America at the very local level by having security plans that the police and the schools and the city planners, we talked last night about some of the urban planning that contributes to more security in cities, but also the social services that help these youth at risk to find a different path economically, but also feeling that they have a better future than going to gangs. And then the last point about the criminal networks is with regards to really looking at hard security and military. And one thing that Partners has been working on in West Africa, piloting in West Africa, is a tool to be able to say, if there's a real challenge with regards to trust in the military, because there is corruption, you've got to kind of see from a systemic approach how you're closing the opportunities for corruption. But if we want to see institutional reform of our military and of our police to be able to deal with this problem, we have to have benchmarks that civil society agrees with the military on what we're shooting for: oversight, professionalism, training. And so we're trying to come up with tools that we can use together to even be able to do the institutional reform work. And then finally, I do think that more and more we're seeing the rising conflict over natural resources. And this isn't anything so new, but in some cases it becomes more violent or becomes more polarized throughout the world. Whether it's very large footprint companies with regards to the way that we are using resources in this world, which means more mining, more oil extraction, to have your iPhone, there's a whole bunch of minerals that are in here that are, conflict minerals. How do we address this issue? Because more than any other social conflict, there are big power imbalances in these situations. And it's because of globalization. In large part, the very local communities are feeling the effect of social conflict by these economic drivers. So one of the strategies that we've been working is that there are several international platforms for recognizing and trying to mitigate the social conflict around these big businesses of resource extraction, that we are using these platforms, and they're mostly out of the United Nations and others, as an excuse to dialogue at the local level. And what do I mean by that? The Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, EITI is what it's called. And it's the idea that companies and governments voluntarily agree to post the tax revenue that comes from the mining sector. So at least we know how much money is coming out of the sector and how the government hopefully is using it. These are principles. You sign on to EITI, but it's supposed to be a tripartite process. And so more than anything, we say, listen, there are these standards. We can convene locally to discuss the implementation of the standards. And we've been doing this in Senegal. We've been doing this in Peru. Another aspect of the natural resource conflict is hard security issues, meaning if there are conflicts around wind farms, I don't know if you realize how conflictive wind farms are in a lot of Latin America, then the companies bring in private security or use the military to protect their economic interest. And so now there are standards coming from the UN called the Voluntary Principles, which are with regards to what are your responsibilities in a human rights approach to make sure that security is really conducted in a human rights sensitive way. And so the implementation of these principles is what the challenge is. We're trying to bring civil society in with the companies, with the government, to just discuss how this security policy should unfold. What I want to then finally say is that we have to work with businesses on these issues. And this is a big challenge. And more than even businesses, we have to work with investors, who actually probably see as the risk management the social conflict, and they want to have good, peaceful, enabling environments to be making their profits, and also recognize the need of the community and the sustainability of the efforts. So I'm going to end there by just to acknowledge we do have the tools. Actually, we do have the tools to be thinking systemically, to be helping to convene the right discussions. But we do have to force ourselves to get outside of our comfort zone to work with other entities. And I wanted to just mention one last example, because Dushan thought it was interesting last night at dinner, that, with regards to the media, I am particularly inspired right now about the positive power of the media that has a megaphone globally. The entertainment industry, the advertisers, the gamers, they are affecting society much more than we are in our tiny little civil society level. So I'm trying to make the better links with the people who really know how to affect our stories and the stories that we're telling each other. And I don't know how many of you have seen a Coca-Cola commercial that was actually selling the idea of peace between India and Pakistan. They're selling Coke, but the feeling of Coke, right? Coke and a smile. Well, this was Coke and peace between India and Pakistan. So someone in a private firm that was hired by a huge global company thought to themselves, peace sells. So I thought, we need to meet this person and we need to talk to them about how they think this idea sells, because we need to sell this idea ourselves in a better, more sophisticated way. So this firm is called Leo Burnett. Actually, they have a very interesting kind of social cause marketing, which actually this sells now, the cause marketing, yeah. But they're offering some pro bono support to our network now, specifically in Colombia, a country in a current conflict, negotiating a peace agreement. These issues of reconciliation and forgiveness are real to these people. And we can't take for granted that Colombia will go down the path of peace. It's actually a question right now. So how do we support a campaign, but not just posters, not just an advertisement, but a real campaign? And so the big thinkers of Leo Burnett are helping us think about this now. These are the kinds of collaborations that I want to just push you to think differently about your work. And then finally, I'm just going to also mention Ray, to say, there was a moment where he was thinking democratic governance together with conflict transformation. This is why we talk about, what in our name, democratic change. And I want to acknowledge that Partners Slovakia is a real leader in our network. That we draw upon the leadership of Dusan and Kaya. For the last 20 years, they are shaping the way that we think. They've helped us establish Partners Colombia. Well, I can only speak even in my time, but this is, the last 6 years. They've helped us to create Partners Yemen. They are with us in Nigeria. They are with us in Bahrain. And I just want to acknowledge that we really rely on the creative leadership of your colleagues here in Slovakia to help us shape the work that we're doing globally. And it's just a real honor to be here with I mean this the right way, the grandfather of our network.